Hello, welcome to Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking. In this video, we'll be taking a look at rule number 3 of our critical thinking set of rules. Just so you know, you can follow along. We're using a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. So I hope you guys are doing well. We've been looking at various rules for critical thinking. Our first rule had to do with the idea that we should identify premises and conclusions. Our second rule was the idea that we should develop our ideas and our arguments in a natural order of inference. And today we're going to be looking at rule 3, the idea that we need to start from reliable premises. Okay, so just keep in mind here, just as another refresher, every argument has both premises and a conclusion. The conclusion is the claim that you're trying to prove. It's the thesis that the person is making in the argument, to use the language of an English paper. The premises are the reasons that support your conclusion, your thesis. They are the evidence. The premises are ultimately the support, right? The reasons. Now, there's lots of different types of premises. There's lots of different types of arguments. But in general, you want to make sure that your premises are ultimately good premises. Because remember, if you're making an argument, your argument is only as strong as the evidence that you give for the argument. So you have to start from reliable premises. Another way to remember this is that if the premises of the argument are weak, guess what? The argument is also weak. So you need to start from reliable premises. Now, knowing which premises are reliable can be difficult, actually. Right? Remember, of course, that a premise is the reason or the set of reasons for a given claim, right? For a given statement, a thesis, whatever, right? So there's a couple different things you can ask. Number one is the premise true? That is, for instance, if someone says, Harry Potter is the best magician there ever was because he went to Hogwarts Academy, right? So the argument there is, what's the conclusion? That Harry Potter is the best magician. What's the premise? That he went to Hogwarts. Well, ask yourself, is that premise true? No, we know it's not true because it's a fiction book, obviously, right? So when we evaluate other arguments that are not obviously false or silly, right, we may or may not know if a premise is true, which means that we have to actually do a little research and evaluate it. If we're not sure if a premise is true, we can at least assess whether or not it's plausible. Is it even likely that the premise could be true? Or is it unlikely? And at worst case, maybe you know that it's false. So I think the first question you have to ask when you're looking at the premises of an argument, either an argument that you're making or an argument that you're evaluating, in either case, you have to ask yourself, okay, the premises that are being set out, the reasons that are supposed to support this conclusion, are they true? Are they likely? Are they plausible or are they false? A second question that's related is the question of, and not always as easy to answer, is does the premise ultimately relate to the conclusion as support? Right? Sometimes you can have arguments that have premises, but the premises only kind of just a little bit match the conclusion. The conclusion can sort of go off in a different direction. This is actually called missing the point fallacy, where your conclusion misses the point, the relationship that the premises are creating. So one of the questions to ask here is, well, okay, maybe this is a plausible premise, but does it actually relate to the conclusion that's being made? And not just related by association, but related inferentially. That is, that if you accept the premise, does that entail that you should also accept the conclusion? If you can accept the premise but still reject the conclusion, then there's probably not a very strong inferential link or relationship between the premise and the conclusion. A third sort of thing to ask, or at least sort of advice here, is when you're making your own argument, use premises that are reliable, that are accessible and open to all. Now, the idea here is that the goal of making an argument when you're making your own is to convince others, right? You can't convince others if the reasons you give them are unknown to your listener or to your reader, right? That is, if you give reasons that only a specialist would know, then that means your argument is really only credible for a specialist. because only a specialist can evaluate whether or not the premises are true, plausible, etc. Right? So you have to know your audience partially. And when you do know your audience, you need to gauge the reliability, accessibility, and also the transparency of the evidence you're giving for an argument. This is really quite important, and oftentimes this gets passed over. Now, what are we doing in the exercise set for this section? The exercise set for this section is pretty simple. What they're going to have you do is they're going to give you a passage, and then you're going to rewrite it. And then you're going to evaluate the premises, right? So when you get the passage, first you've got to figure out what's the conclusion and what's the premise. We're still building on that first rule of reasoning, know the premises and the conclusion. You've got to figure out what the conclusion is, and then what you've got to do is rewrite it in the order that makes the most sense, given Rule 2, and then determine whether or not the premises are sufficient. That is, are they reliable? Are they accessible? Etc., etc. Do they miss the point? Are they inferentially and logically related to the conclusion to which they're supposed to support? So here's an example here. Computers will soon take over most human tasks. After all, Deep Blue, a computer, beat Garry Kasparov, and that's misspelled, the world chess champion in 1997. And if computers can defeat the best human in an activity that symbolizes intelligence more than any other, then surely their supremacy in everything else is not far off. Their supremacy in everything else we do is not far off. Okay, so if we take this argument, let's take the passage. Now, I'm not going to rewrite it because it's too difficult for me to rewrite it here. But let's first off just figure out what's the conclusion. It looks like the conclusion in this case is the very first sentence. Computers will soon take over most of the human tasks. Why? Because then they give this argument about first Deep Blue in 97, and they say that chess is a good marker for human intelligence, therefore the supremacy of the computers is not far off, right? So, in fact, this last one, surely the supremacy and everything else is not far off, is really sort of a restatement of this conclusion. Now, let's take a look at the premises here, and I think that there's really sort of two key premises. The first one is the Deep Blue premise. After all, Deep Blue, a computer, beat Garry Kasparov. That's true. I actually watched the game back in the day on TV. Sounds dorky, I know. The world chess champion. So that's a pretty big feat. So it means that computers certainly can take over some human tasks. But in this case, the only task is chess, playing a game. Now, here, the second premise is meant to support this idea by saying that, well, chess is an activity that symbolizes great intelligence more than any others. Now, a couple things. If we're evaluating these premises, the first question I have is this. It says computers will take over most human tasks. Well, Garry Kasparov was beat in 1997. As far as I can tell, most of the human tasks that humans do have not been taken over by computers, potentially augmented by computers, but haven't been taken over, especially since 1997, right? The other thing I would question in this premise is the notion that chess is the best symbolic activity of intelligence. Just because someone's good at chess doesn't mean that they're intelligent in other areas. And in fact, the type of intelligence that's used actually in chess computers is not the same type of intelligence that human beings seem to be able to use in very good ways. So for instance, to give you an example, we do have computers that can beat people in chess, but those same computers cannot beat people in other games like checkers. Arguably, checkers is easier, right? Or another example would be with Scrabble, right? A chess computer is only good at doing chess. Humans are good at doing other things. So you can see here, when we start to evaluate the premises, there's degrees of relevance and there's degrees of strength that seem to allow. Overall, my impression is that this argument is something of a fairly weak argument, ultimately predicting supremacies of computers based upon a chess computer doesn't seem enough, because ultimately humans are still far more intelligent in a whole bunch of different ways than merely chess. So what you have to ask here is, what's the conclusion? What are the premises? And then evaluate those premises, okay? That's the exercise we're going to be taking a look at today. Whoops. And then we're going to be looking at Rule 4. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you guys online.